This program is made possible by all the wonderful people who are members of WQED.
This program is part of WQED's Pittsburgh History Series.
Some Pittsburghers used to call this neighborhood Little Harlem, but most people have always called it the Hill District, or just the Hill. From the 30s through the 50s, the Hill thrived, and part of it was one of the most lively, prosperous, and influential black neighborhoods in America.
We had 5 theaters, we had drugstores, we had furniture stores. Whatever there was in the city, we had in the Hill.
The Hill District was for the Pittsburgh area what Harlem was to New York. It was a center for music, for art, for literature.
The Hill was a thriving, bustling, safe community.
I thought it was the most exciting place I'd ever been in my life.
One street ran the entire length of the Hill into downtown, Wylie Avenue.
Wylie Avenue was the center of all kinds of activity, and it really ran 24 hours a day. It's the only street in a metropolitan city in America that begins at a church and ends at a jail.
Wylie Avenue represented the heart and soul of the Hill when the Hill was in its heyday. This program is the story of those magic times, what we're calling Wylie Avenue Days. Just east of downtown Pittsburgh, beyond the Civic Arena, lies the neighborhood called the Hill. Much of what used to be the Hill is gone now. The Civic Arena is where the lower hill used to be. And when you drive through the upper half, you discover a neighborhood struggling to renew itself. But it wasn't always this way. When Pittsburgh was the Smoky City, the Hill was a jumping-off point for immigrants. Then, large numbers of African Americans fleeing persecution in the South and seeking jobs in the industrial promised land came to the Hill. During that period, from the mid-1930s to almost the 1960s, they created a diverse and powerful black community.
There was practically every kind of business that you would want, especially to do shopping. You could buy your school clothes and not leave the Hill. You could buy fresh meat.
It was its own world. It was a unique demographic phenomenon. I mean, it was unique in and of itself. The way the various groups lived and worked and interacted with each other was unique.
There were black-owned and operated jewelry shops, dry cleaners, doctors and lawyers' offices, printing shops, summer camps, and much more. Yeah, the Hill was really jumping. Open all night. That's the way most people describe the Hill in its heyday. The place really hummed, and you went along for the ride whether you wanted to or not. Take, for example, Good's Pharmacy on the corner of Fullerton and Wylie. Bill Good's sister, Ruth White, managed the fountain on opening night.
We opened, it was going to be open till 11 o'clock at night. And there's so many people were in the store at 11 o'clock, and they kept coming in. Every time we decided we were going to close, more people would come in, and people were in there all night. And that's when he decided we might as well throw the key away and just keep the store open 24 hours. And that's how it became a 24-hour drugstore, the first night.
Good's had an unbeatable location. In fact, the corner of Fullerton and Wylie became known as the crossroads of the world.
Everything happened on that corner. Stanley's was across the street, and it was, of course, a bar and a nightclub. And Woogie's Barbershop was down at the other corner, and Crawford Grill #1 was at the corner across from Woogie's Barbershop, and people just came and went all the time. It was never a dull moment in that store at night.
The Hill just wasn't a dull neighborhood. In fact, the Hill nurtured some great talents. Billy Eckstein, Lena Horne, Errol Garner, Ahmed Jamal, and Mary Lou Williams. They all lived in the Hill at one time or another. So did jazz great George Benson.
Georgie Benson? I watched Georgie Benson sell papers right there on the corner in front of the drugstore. He'd come in and he'd say to me, Miss Ruth, would you loan me 3 cents so I can get an ice cream cone? And I think now, when I think of how well he's doing, you know, these are the days that you remember.
Everyone who grew up in the Hill in those days has some magic memories of the place. Louise Evans moved to Pittsburgh when she was 9 years old from Egypt, North Carolina. To her, Wylie Avenue seemed like another world.
Oh my, yes. It seemed like people never went to bed. And old men would sit out and play checkers until way over into the night. And the people sat out on their stoops and hollered back and forth to one another. And in those days, you could sleep on the fire escapes. Many times it would be so hot, we would get out on the fire escapes and take a sheet or an old quilt and sleep on the fire escapes. But I don't know when the people went to bed. I really don't, because I would just last as long as I could, and then I'd wake up and it would be morning with the soot in the nostrils and, you know, oily skin. You had soot on your face too.
Jim Henry was born at home here on the corner of Wanless and Webster. One of his fondest memories is of getting Sunday dinner.
Mrs. Williams had a live chicken store right on Center Avenue up from Kirkpatrick, and you'd go in and she'd pick out a chicken, go in the back room, you'd hear a little noise, and she had a big pot of hot water, and boom, she wrapped it up in some wax paper, and that was dinner the next day.
Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright August Wilson grew up on Bedford Avenue.
I guess my earliest memories of 3rd, 4th grade, coming home from school. And as I got older, I gradually came to understand that we lived in a mixed neighborhood. The neighborhood, there was a lot of Syrians, a lot of Italians, blacks. It was, in every sense of the word, a neighborhood.
People with names at Hard Times and Flourished. I never did know what Flourished meant, but there was a man named Flourished. When he was sober, he stuttered and you could hardly understand him, but boy, when he got drunk, he sounded like a English lord. Well, there was a man that they called Death. He was very skinny, and it was obvious that he was not well, but people called him Death. Church, the one-legged man with all the keys on his belt, and he was an electrician. And I don't know why they called him Church, because he was the most profane man I've ever heard. Just every other word that came out of his mouth was a cuss word.
Albert Johnson remembers going to the movies.
At that time, they only cost 12 cents, but boy, you had to really scuffle to get 12 cents. You collected pop bottles and everything else you could do, ran errands to get that 12 cents.
Mike Flournoy moved to Pittsburgh from Birmingham, Alabama. In Birmingham, he got used to a lot of greenery.
Pittsburgh didn't have any greenery. And one of my greatest experiences was to witness houses that sat so close to the street that I had to learn some new skills. And one of the skills I had to learn was how to avoid automobiles within 2 seconds after you step outside of the house.
Black immigrants who moved to the Hill from the South faced other challenges too. The Great Migration reached its peak during the Depression, but many blacks came here during World War I. Estelle Blanks remembers that in 1917, life was hard. That's the year she followed her husband to Pittsburgh to escape poverty and repression in Lowndes County, Alabama. But the conditions they found here weren't much better at first.
When he came here, the people were living in cellars, dirt floors. Some of them had to sleep on the floor on dirt floors because they didn't have nowhere to stay.
University of Pittsburgh professor Rollo Turner says some of the men lived in boxcars on the railroad.
Literally, railroad companies would string together a bunch of boxcars, cut holes in the cars for windows, and then charge them in 5 cents a night to sleep in them. And I think Pittsburgh was second to North New Jersey in terms of bad housing at this time, and certainly had one of the highest tuberculosis rates within the black community.
Eventually, Congress passed legislation to improve living conditions. And as more and more poor Southern blacks arrived and mixed with those blacks who were already here and prospering, the stage was set. Black institutions developed that were unrivaled in their scope and breadth.
They thrived because, in part, because of segregation and racism and discrimination. There was a world, there were boundaries to that world, primarily established by a white community. But within that world, people developed institutions that had their own character, their own strength, their own power. They were truly strong institutions.
One of the strongest institutions in the Hill was this newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier. Its offices were near the top of Wylie Avenue. The Courier started out as a small neighborhood weekly. Albert Johnson remembers how it quickly became an important paper.
When we were little, if you wanted to find out something about some other part of the country, as far as black people were concerned, the Courier was the only source. Unless it was something that impacted on the white community, black news was no news.
Under the leadership of its publisher, Robert L. Vann, the Pittsburgh Courier grew into the largest black weekly in America. There was a Pittsburgh City edition, a national edition, and 14 special regional editions, one for each of the country's major cities.
They didn't have television, so you read the papers. You went out and bought the paper. We didn't miss buying the Courier on Thursday. That's the first thing you bought. You know, if you went to the store, you stopped to buy the Courier. You read that Courier because anybody who was anybody was in that Courier. And you knew what they were doing because you read the Courier. Yeah.
Today, the new Pittsburgh Courier publishes out of these offices on the South Side. Getting the paper delivered to its readers is pretty routine now, but distributing the paper across the nation in the 30s and 40s was a challenge. Rod Doss recalls one of the obstacles.
In the early days of the Courier, it was very difficult for papers to be sent down south and placed strategically in a lot of stores.
White companies would often refuse to transport or deliver a colored newspaper. To get the paper out, the Courier called on the president of the Pullman Porters, the union of black men who worked as porters on trains across the country.
He consigned a lot of his porters to make sure that the papers were delivered to strategic points down south, and hence that's how the Courier emerged as the leader with the largest amount of circulation in southern states at that time.
Even though the Courier was a national paper, a lot of its news still came from the bustling Hill and Wylie Avenue. So did its pictures. A whole generation of black photographers worked on the Courier. One of them was Teenie Harris.
You know, I never went to school. I didn't take no pictures and no photography in school. I learned all this by just myself.
During his career, Teenie took over 80,000 pictures of black life in Pittsburgh. But while other photographers could take several different shots of each news event, Teenie only took one. And one day, when he was covering Governor Lawrence, that earned him a permanent nickname.
They're all out there with a little old 35 millimeters snapping, and I'd be sitting back and waiting on them, and Governor Lawrence would hunch the other fellow, said, "Here he comes now." He said he called me One Shot.
One Shot Harris couldn't afford to use more than a single frame of film and a single flash bulb to capture his subject. Then he'd pop the used flash bulb into his pocket to make the point.
I just, after I snap you like this, and I just grab the ball and put it in my pocket. See, I used to play basketball, you know.
Besides national issues, the Courier devoted sections to sports, religion, cooking and the home, and the society scene along Wylie Avenue. Clubs for women and men were an important part of that scene. In the 40s, these back issues of the Courier listed over 50 different organizations for women. A woman could join the Aurora Reading Club, the Pittsburgh Pioneers, or a group called the Ducks. There were clubs for men, too. Some of them grew out of business relationships, like the Black Professional Association. But one of the most well-known and influential clubs in the Hills started purely for fun, the Frogs. It's still around today. David Washington and Percy Garland are two of its members.
Well, there's limited places you could go for social affairs. You couldn't have a social affair in downtown Pittsburgh or any of the Class A establishments or restaurants or hotels or anything. So it was a special community that blacks had to establish.
The Frogs. The name stands for friendly rivalry, often generates success. Have been meeting for dinner once a month since the early 1900s. They were famous for Frog Week, a summer week of parties, dances, concerts, games, and the Frog Formal.
People would come from California to Chicago, down south, from all points of the country to be here for Frog Week, and it was a very, very, very fine affair and was well behaved. It was a very nice affair. It was just about the nicest thing that you could attend.
Most of the Frogs were also members of another, larger men's club, the Wylie Club. The Wylie Club had its own three-story building near the corner of Wylie and Fullerton.
It had a great deal of camaraderie, and everyone you knew there was interesting.
If there were black celebrities in town, you would probably end up rubbing elbows with them at the Wylie. Count Basie and Duke Ellington were regulars. Frank Bolden, a reporter for the Courier, remembers one night the Wylie earned its place in the history of jazz.
Duke Ellington used to sit in there. One night he was in there playing, and we had Gumdrops there with us, and we called him Gumdrops. That's Earl Garner. His nickname was Gumdrops. You get him to play all night for a bag of Gumdrops. Then later we went around to the Wylie Club, and Duke sat there until 7 in the morning. He finished the composition, I Let a Song Go Out of My Heart. He finished it right there in the Wylie Club.
I let a song go out of my heart. It was the sweetest melody. I know I lost heaven.
A night out on the social scene meant looking good from head to toe. There was no place to get that do done better than at LaSalle's. Willona Graves, who's demonstrating the finger wave here, owned LaSalle's. It was a salon and beauty college, and Willona's sisters worked for her. They remember what she wanted to do for young black women.
To teach some of, especially our girls, the colored girls, that's what we were called at that time, to be able to do something else besides housework for the white people. We wanted them to be able to work for themselves. She was the first one to have black and white students in her school, and so many students have went on to their own business and are still operating today.
LaSalle's didn't discriminate when it came to students or customers. White or black, you could get the latest styles at LaSalle's. Of course, that might mean you had to get wired into this contraption.
The permanent wave then had to be wrapped on little rods, and electricity was used a certain amount of time to set the wave in the permanent. No one was never electrocuted, no.
According to a 1936 beauty supply catalog, this was the ideal of beauty for blacks. If you believed it, then you bought chemicals, relaxers, and what they called fade creams to give you that light, bright, and almost white look. Many advertisers successfully played upon the myth that the whiter you were, the more beautiful you looked. But by this time, many of the Hills residents had their own ideas about black beauty and held contests to prove it. These women are competing in the Miss BPA beauty pageant, sponsored by the Black Professional Association. It ran for a full week and culminated with a swimsuit competition and talent show. Albert Johnson remembers how much everyone enjoyed the pageant.
All the young fellas looked forward to the beauty pageant. That was the beauty crown of Pittsburgh. It was the one that everybody shot for.
To get into this pageant, you had to be sponsored by a club or a business.
If they had a pretty waitress in the group or they had a pretty employee who had some talent, that was the person who would represent their business. It was a lot of fun.
The pageants, the frogs, and the private clubs were the height of sophistication in the Hill. But the really big event was just the opposite. The summer picnic.
There were games. All of the games were competitive manual games. There were races. There was a prize drawing. And there was something for everybody. It was a real fun country picnic. And the Hill District would practically be vacated.
The picnic started early and lasted well into the night. There were all kinds of entertainment, big band concerts, dances, and talent shows, like this exotic South Seas review. Most of the events at the summer picnic were at Sully's Pool in South Park. Things got a little crowded at times, but it was Sully's or nothing. It was the only pool where blacks were admitted.
Now, at that time, there was a large pool, a very, very large pool at South Park, which African Americans were not allowed to go in. In fact, if you tried to go there, chances are that you would end up in the hospital, if not dead.
Yet, despite discrimination and segregation, most people have fond memories of the picnics and the good times they had there.
What did we care? Because after all, we didn't have anything else. We enjoyed ourselves because at that time it was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So this was all right as far as we were concerned. It was in the 40s, really, when they had the picnics at Sully's Grove.
It was a very, very, very good, I have a very good memory of the picnic, and words can't do justice to the fun that everybody had.
The Hill had picnics and parties, but the real center of social life was the church, and the Hill has always had many distinguished churches. These scenes were shot outside of Ebenezer Baptist Church in the 1940s. That church at the top of Wylie Avenue is John Wesley AME Zion. There's also Mother Bethel, said to be the oldest congregation of color west of the Alleghenies. Bethel was the site of many civil rights meetings. And the Hill has supported many other congregations and denominations, like Warren United Methodist and Central and Monumental Baptist churches. Another well-known Hill church is St. Benedict the Moor, the first black Catholic church in Pittsburgh. It stands just a few blocks from Wylie Avenue, at Center and Crawford. On its 100th anniversary, the parish celebrated with this special service. Father Louis Vallone, the priest here now, grew up in the Hill.
You came to the church for any and everything. You came on Sunday, for your prayers. You came on Saturday nights for the dances. You came through the week for education. That's where you met your future spouse. That's where you picked the children that your kids played along with. That's where you got guidance and advice. That's where you got material help.
Everyone is welcome at St. Benedict the Moor these days, but that wasn't always true. In the 30s, the bishop excluded whites from the congregation.
Because a number of whites were more drawn to the warmth, the closeness, the service, the activity going on, and the fact that the church was very poor, that the bishop thought that that would be not conducive to the independence of the black church, and so he forbid whites to come in and be members of it.
When you look at the Hill from downtown, one of the first things you see is the statue on top of the church. It was erected in 1965. Today, it's the subject of some controversy. The statue's hands and face are white, but St. Benedict, the church's namesake, was black.
When the statue originally went up, the hands and face were black. He's been up there for 25 years, and the paint has simply worn off. I would be more than happy to restore the face and hands to the original black color, except no contractor that we've ever brought around has been willing to crawl all the way on up there and try to paint the face and hands to the original black.
In addition to churches, picnics, parties, and pageants, Wylie Avenue was also abuzz with businesses, some of which flourished because of the sorry fact that blacks were often not welcome outside of the Hill, as Douglas King remembers.
At that time, they couldn't go in most anywhere and sit down and eat. There was very few, even an Isley chain that we had here in Pittsburgh, the ice cream place. I remember when I was a kid, we could not eat. We could go in and get an ice cream, but we couldn't sit down in the Isleys and eat the ice cream cone. We had to go outside, take it out with us.
You were unwelcome downtown, so you didn't go. Women could not go downtown and try on a dress. You had to buy things without trying them on. And as far as men were concerned, there were a lot of stores that didn't even want you in the store.
But things were different along Wylie Avenue.
In that time, black people needed white people or Jewish people or whatever, and they needed us too, because we had, what money we had was spent with them.
Practically every shop owner had a tab for families, and once payday came, I guess that was one of the things your father or mother did, was go around and pay on or pay off some of the tabs that they had accumulated between paydays.
Johnson Studios was one of the businesses that thrived in the Hill. It was run by Luther Johnson Sr., a commercial photographer, with the help of his son, Albert Johnson. He'll never forget one of the things his father filmed, the Black Professional Association Annual Parade. Every year it threaded its way through the crowded streets of the Hill and ended up on Wylie Avenue.
For a neighborhood parade, it was one of the biggest parades in the city. In fact, it might have been the biggest parade in the city for a neighborhood parade. The pride was there. You were always happy to see the representation of all of the things that you had worked for.
Most businesses had some kind of float. Here's the one for the Courier, and that one belongs to Johnson Studios. There are lots of stories about the businesses behind these floats. Take this one, for example, the Owl Cab Company. In the 30s and 40s, black-owned cabs were only allowed to pick up passengers in black neighborhoods.
If they got caught picking up someone downtown, the driver was arrested and the cab company was fined.
Here's a float for a business that made it big with pies, Nesbitt's. When you were looking for a good meal and a special dessert, the Hill had a lot to offer in the way of restaurants. One of the most well-known was at the corner of Wylie and Janella, Nesbitt's Pie Shop.
It was the class restaurant. If you wanted to eat in a nice environment, that was the place to go.
The dinner menu featured main courses, like Nesbitt's crispy, moist, and delicious fried chicken, and his mouth-watering, juicy, 1-inch thick slab of roast beef. And one thing was for sure, you wouldn't leave without trying one of the pies Nesbitt's made famous. Today, people still look hungry when you ask them about his strawberry, pumpkin, and coconut custard pies. And then there was the almost legendary sweet potato pie.
Sweet potato pie is one of the best pies in the world. It's made out of sweet potatoes or yams. It's like a custard pie, except for the fact that it's heavier than a custard pie. And there's nothing that tastes like it.
Another thing that made Nesbitt special was George Nesbitt. He's the one in the suit.
He was a personable fellow,
And he was a Booker T. Washington devotee. He figured that blacks needed an economic base. He preached it all the time.
A few blocks down the street at 1411 Wylie Avenue was another successful black business, McAvoy's Jeweler. Here's Mr. McAvoy at work. And here's Mrs. McAvoy waiting on a customer. They worked hard together to make McAvoy's a success. Hard work paid off for other businesses too. Since 1947, William Pryor has been making fur coats in this shop near Wylie Avenue. This is his son, William Pryor Jr., and this is his grandson, William Pryor III.
When I was my grandson's age, 19 years old, I was one of the fastest operators in the East. And the person that taught me was one of the fastest, and of course I improved on what he did. See? So here I am today enjoying it.
Bill's speed and skill with these sewing machines helped him survive at the height of segregation in Pittsburgh. He remembers it as a time when colored people weren't allowed to compete with white people for most jobs. It was even harder for businessmen.
At that time, speaking of the colored people of Pittsburgh, you weren't accepted downtown. And there were very, very few jobs that were available and no space at all available.
Some discrimination was prohibited, but it usually popped up in a subtler form. There was a law against refusing space to merchants like Bill based on color. There was also a way around it.
And one of the ways, instead of telling you no, they just raise the price so you can't pay it. And that way, I'm not discriminating. I just charge you $150 for what costs $30.
To get around the segregation, black businessmen had to be creative. Bill Pryor was typical. Many coat buyers wouldn't buy from a black business. They went to the fashionable, white-owned stores downtown, where black people weren't allowed to shop. But these stores recognized the quality of Bill's work, so they sent the orders on to him. He would actually make the coat, then the store would sew on their own label.
A lot of the persons that didn't patronize me at that time, they would take their stuff into town, and then almost before they got back home, I should say, I would be called, Bill, come and this is what I want you to do. And I would make it and do it and return it to them, and this is how I survived until I could have my retail business.
Every facet of life along Wylie Avenue was influenced in some way by segregation and discrimination. Just as the Hill had its own business and social life, it also had its own brand of police. Take a closer look at this unit of Hill police marching in this parade. Almost all of them were over 6 feet tall. The one in front was Pittsburgh's first black police lieutenant, Jim Robinson. Now look towards the back row. Second in from the left, that's Oliver Mason. On the street, they called him Two-Gun Mason.
Ollie Mason. He'd shoot you about 8 or 9 times after it hurt. You were allowed to carry one revolver, supposed to be nothing over a 45. Oliver carried 2 magnums. One time they called him in on the carpet for carrying a machine gun. Nobody knew where he got it from. Oliver used to always say, you know good dead. He didn't believe in giving them a chance to kill him. He said if they weren't doing wrong, they wouldn't get shot.
But as tough as Ollie Mason was in keeping order on the streets of the Hill, he took care of its residents in other ways too.
He had in his car, his trunk of his car was full of bicycle parts and bicycle tools. And he used to ride along, and if he saw a kid with a bike, he would stop him and oil the bike up, tighten it up, and maybe if he saw something wrong with the pedals are bad, he'd take the pedal off and put a new pedal on. Free of charge, he'd just do this. He just loved to help the kids.
He was respected as one of our better police, and if Mr. Mason told you, no, you don't do it, then you didn't do it.
It's strange that the wonderful things that blacks have done down through the years, nobody mentions them, and they're not remembered, just like they didn't exist. There was not a policeman in Pittsburgh that ever been, as far as I know, in the history that I've read of Pittsburgh, that could compare with Oliver Mason.
The Hill was a different place then. Violent crime and burglary were relatively rare.
This was the atmosphere that existed in the Hill at that time. You didn't have to worry about somebody knocking you in the head or robbing you or jumping on you, insinuating that you had no business in the Hill or anything like that. This didn't exist at that time. People were not afraid to come to the Hill.
But there was illegal activity along Wylie Avenue: after-hours clubs, prostitution, and the numbers. The numbers game was like an unofficial lottery. Controlling the numbers racket was lucrative, and the men who wrote the numbers became the Hill's financial tycoons. They also became the Hill's folk heroes.
We had two people that we had to depend on in those days, and that was the ministers and the number writers.
Probably the most honest and trustworthy people that ever came through the Pittsburgh area were your numbers writers. And for the Hill District, the numbers writers were not organized crime. You know, the numbers writers were not criminals. Okay, the numbers writers were your uncle and your cousin Joey, and it went all across, again, the ethnic lines.
It's interesting to note that the police, or the killjoys in blue as we call them, rarely arrested people that were engaged in numbers. They were hard on shoplifters and street fighting and crap games in the middle of the street and things like that, but never numbers, because it meant so much to unemployed people. See, 1 penny could win you $7.
Two of the most famous numbers writers were Woogie Harris, the owner of Woogie's Crystal Barbershop, and Gus Greenlee, who owned the Crawford Grill, among other things.
If you talk to 100 people about Gus and Woogie, 99 of them will have very favorable things to say about them. They were that kind of individuals. They were dynamic, they were generous, they were compassionate, but they made their money in illegal business. The numbers, in fact, it's alleged that in 1925, when Gus Greenlee came to Pittsburgh, that he brought the numbers with him.
Some of our professional men, doctors and lawyers, set up their offices with loans from them. And remember, there wasn't anything, in my opinion, there wasn't anything wrong with it when the banks wouldn't loan you money.
They were illegal, but they still had them, and I mean, they made a lot of money. They were respected, they were, because I'll tell you why. They did a lot of good for the community. They were not men who made money and kept it in their pocket.
The Digitarians, as they were called, put their money into civic events, political campaigns, and helped neighbors in hard times. But they may best be remembered for fostering the development of America's favorite pastime.
Jackie Robinson hit that ball. It went zooming off the left field wall. Yeah, boy. Yes, Jackie hits that ball. When he swung his bat, the crowd was...
Gus Greenlee built his own ballpark called Greenlee Field. His team was the Pittsburgh Crawfords. Along with the Homestead Grays, another local Negro team, they soon carved a name for themselves in baseball lore.
They beat every team in sight. And we used to stop off there at the grill at night just to sit and talk with them. And that's where the story originated. Satchel Paige said that Cool Papa Bell was so fast that he could turn the switch of the light and get in bed before the light went out. But that didn't impress me as much as the one Oscar Charlton said, that's slow. Said when he was coming up, he was so fast that he would hit a single down the right field line, and the ball would hit him as he rounded first going to second base. Now that's really motoring.
The Pittsburgh Crawfords were known around the nation. Both they and the Grays were prominently featured in the national editions of the Pittsburgh Courier. The Crawfords and the Grays provided a recreational outlet for the Hill. Look how dressed up everybody was for the games. That's Gus Greenlee in the stands.
They had the skill to compete probably with anyone, but they really put on a show. And the home run hitter was intimidating, and he got up there like Mike Tyson with an intimidating expression. Third baseman might get up and do a dance before swinging at the ball. It was a form of entertainment as well as watching good sport.
The Negro Leagues had great players. They sometimes played in the big league parks, and every now and then they played against white major leaguers, and usually won.
To me, it was a great time. We didn't realize how great it was at the time that we lived through that, but it was a great time.
The Hill also turned out for the sport of boxing. There were Golden Gloves fights and world championships. The 1951 heavyweight championship fight between Jersey Joe Walcott and Ezzard Charles was at Forbes Field. It drew the largest fight crowd in Pittsburgh history, but the local boxers were still the favorites.
Charlie Burley was probably one of the best boxers of all time. I know that Fritzie refused to fight him, and I also know Sugar Ray Robinson refused to fight him. He could box. He was an excellent boxer.
There was a time, if you had to find someone and he wasn't taking in a boxing match or a baseball game, chances are he would be hanging out at a barbershop on Wylie Avenue.
Hey, what's going on? Who are these people?
Today, Archie's Place on Fifth Avenue is a descendant of those barbershops. This is the owner and head barber, Archie Creighton.
I classify a barber's job as tops. He might not be rich, but he sure has got a classic job. Because everybody got to take his hat off too, whether he like you or not. He got to take his hat off.
When Archie was starting out as a barber, he worked in one of the most famous shops on the hill, Woogie Harris's Crystal Barbershop.
You see all the celebrities from every which way from all over the world. Everybody knew him. And they would come in, you got a chance to see a lot of folks you never would have seen, ordinarily.
Today's haircuts may look different from the 40s, but Archie sees a lot of similarities.
They got different names for it, but the base is the same haircut. Like the High English, that's the old haircut. Now they got it, they call it the boxes. Ain't nothing but the High English. We used to laugh at folks with them. Now this one got to be popular. That's what it is now. Check that out and see how you like it.
Other styles are gone, though. There used to be a homemade mixture for straightening your hair called concholine. If it wasn't used right, it would burn your scalp so badly you would end up temporarily bald.
White potatoes and bread and lye, and you made it together in grease. And during that time, people wasn't too slick on doing it. They didn't know how to grease the hair, and they just stick it right on the head, and the hair plaster your head. You wash your head, the whole thing come off.
Look like the scorched earth. I'm telling you.
Some of the people in Archie's Place remember when Wylie Avenue was the place to go on a date.
Friday, Saturday nights used to be an occasion. Everybody would have on their Sunday best. Go out to bars all over the hill. The girls would look beautiful, and the fellas, I won't say they look beautiful, but they look real nice.
You used to be able to walk in a bar. If you wanted a drink, you could leave your money on the bar and go to the bathroom and come back and still be there when you come back.
The most important thing was getting the girl out of her mother and father's house. Because you had your own options once you did that.
One of the most popular options was to go out dancing, and one of the most popular steps was called trucking.
You put your hand on your hip, then you trucking,
Yeah.
Trucking my blues away. You put your hand on your hip and your finger up and go across the floor. That was something like that, something.
Wylie Avenue had plenty in the way of nightlife. The stars really came out at night on the hill.
Just about anybody who was playing music at that time came here. I know Jack McDuff, who played the organ at Bertie's place, George Kirby, Billy Eckstein. Everybody who was anybody who came to town came to the Crawford Grill. Joe Lewis. All of those people came into the area. Lena Horne. Quite a few of them would come in through that area because this was home for them.
People came from all over town, and the theaters up here we had a lot of the white people, in fact 99% white, and all the nightclubs, they were 99% white. I mean, they came up for service in the evening, and we might relate to Wylie Avenue as you would in some parts of New York, like in Harlem.
He's not exaggerating. In this photo, taken in Pittsburgh, here's Sarah Vaughan, Billy Eckstein, and Dizzy Gillespie. Billy Eckstine's big band often played here, featuring musicians like Art Blakey, John Coltrane, and Dexter Gordon. And here's Cab Calloway in town for an engagement.
There were private clubs, big-time entertainers. It had the reputation that between New York and Chicago, that was the place to be. You had to either go to Chicago or to New York to find more.
Big bands like Artie Shaw, Count Basie, and Duke Ellington would play downtown and then head to an after-hours club in the Hill. The Crawford Grill No. 2 was a jazz mecca in the 50s, and the Musicians Club was also a favorite hangout.
We had Tommy Dorsey there one night playing trombone against two trombone players locally here. And after the session, he went up to the grill, and the food was so good, he overindulged and got stomach burns. And Cy Oliver, who'd formerly played with Jimmy Lunsford, he took him right up to Good's drugstore, and Bill Good mixed him up a concoction that settled his stomach, and he never forgot him. They always remembered. Drugstore in Pittsburgh had saved his life, so he claimed. He just overate, that's all.
Sarah Harley, along with her husband George, owned the Celebrity Cafe. She says that back then, nightlife was the chief form of entertainment.
People used to bar hop. They'd start down at the Grill No. 1 down in Deep Wylie, work their way up to Stanley's at Fullerton Street, come up to our place and work their way on up to Heron Avenue. That was a Saturday night ritual. Well, Art Blakey worked for us, and that's before he got on big time. He used to play a piece called X-Lax and Lima Beans. And I was on the 3rd floor and had this brass bed, and the bed would just jingle whenever he hit the drums. I knew exactly what he was playing.
Henry Belcher is a tap dancer. He performed in some of those floor shows at the Celebrity. That's him on the right, still dancing today. He says Pittsburgh was a valuable training ground before taking your act on the road.
People started telling us you should go to New York, you should go to New York. But I told them, well, I said, no, we're not ready to try to go to New York. Because you go to New York, and if you're not ready, you're coming back from New York right fast.
They capitalized on the Mahatma Gandhi craze and named themselves the Three Mad Magandis. After working the Pittsburgh club circuit for a couple of years, Henry got to live his dream of performing at the world-famous Apollo Theater.
That week they had the Battle of Dancers. They had us on the bill with the Four Step Brothers. They was nationally known all over them. So we went in there, we held our own anyway. But after that, I mean, we were considered New Yorkers then. And everywhere we went then, across the country, we were from New York. We wasn't from Pittsburgh.
In 1948, this was the music everyone strained to hear because this was Mary D's theme song. Mary D was WHOD Radio's hottest DJ. WHOD called itself the Station of Nations because each 15-minute block of programming was dedicated to one of Pittsburgh's ethnic groups, but there was no black show. Mary D figured it was high time for that to change and approached WHOD's manager.
He told her if she could get some people to advertise for him so that they could pay her salary, then they would give her the job. Well, she came back and she had those people. And right after that, she got so many different advertisers. They gave her a short time. And after that, Mary had like three or 4 hours.
Mary took her roving microphone into the community. She did a morning show with her brother, Mal Good, who later became the first black correspondent for ABC News, and a show with her daughter called Teenage Express, Moving Around with the Little D.
She had Moving Around with Mary D, and she broadcast from the window. And she had to, she was in the window, and the kids, Shemmy High School was up the street, and Heron Hill was there. And in the afternoon, you would see all these kids around that window watching her. And if they had put their name up there, she'd say their name on the radio, and that was the greatest thing for them.
Mary D popularized black music to a larger audience, But perhaps Mary Dee's most enduring gift to Pittsburgh was the name she gave to the corner of Fullerton and Wylie.
Mary said, if you come up here to this corner, it's a crossroads of the world. You can go from Stanley's to Goods to the after-hours spots and never miss a beat. And that's how she named it, Crossroads of the World. And people did come from everywhere.
This is what the Crossroads of the World looks like now. The parking lot for the Civic Arena was built over it. But even today, Florence Bridges is still flooded by memories when she stands where the crossroads used to be.
There was so much vitality. There were people everywhere. On that corner was Goods Pharmacy. There was a musicians club. The Washington clubs were over there, the Lolanda clubs. Right there was an old theater called the Rumba Theater. It was a murky theater. It didn't even have a ticket agent. You'd pay your money and then you would go in. They would wave you in. And nobody ever admitted they went to the Rumba Theater. Everybody went in like spies. But they would have the movies after everybody else had the movies. And you would go in, and when your eyes became accustomed to the dark, you'd look around, you'd see everybody you ever knew.
The Rumba Theater and everything else in the Lower Hill was doomed the day the city opened this urban redevelopment office in the late 50s. As they tore down the theaters, businesses, and housing, an entire way of life began to come apart. Wylie Avenue days were coming to a close.
Of course, that just destroyed everything. See, urban renewal always means Negro removal. It doesn't help us any. It might help the city, but doesn't help the minorities at all.
This is one of the most devastating things that ever happened to the black community, was to tear out the Lower Hill, the way it was done. There was no consideration given to where the black people were going to go, what was going to happen to black businesses.
Thousands of people were displaced just to build the Civic Arena. All of Wylie Avenue below Crawford Street, the part that went to the jail, was destroyed.
Well, I'll tell you, it was a sad feeling when I seen all them buildings going down.
The Jewish people went one direction, the Italian people went another direction, and the poor colored people didn't have much choice to go but wherever they could.
Those people who were uprooted with businesses and people who had homes, I doubt if they were compensated for what they gave up and what they lost.
The wrecking crews knocked down the economic base that fueled the Hill. At the same time, the bonds of segregation and discrimination were loosening. As people were forced out of their homes, they left the Hill. Living conditions for those who remained started to slide. Kayla Roy Irvis has lived in the Hill since 1945.
The people whom I knew have been moved out, driven out, bulldozed out, sent elsewhere. The problem is, elsewhere was any place they could find. Elsewhere hadn't been prepared for them. So those wonderful new buildings with their glittering facades really were, as I said, monuments to destruction of a community.
The demolition might have gone further, but the Hill fought back and held the line at Crawford Street. This corner outside St. Benedict the Moor Church became the rallying point. People started calling it Freedom Corner.
The community took a stand here and said, you will no longer take away our housing to put up commercial development. Development will stop here until there's housing provided. From that point on, every parade, every protest, anything of social significance in the city has always started right here on Freedom Corner at the steps of the church.
Then, in 1968, after the death of Martin Luther King, the Hill, along with other neighborhoods across the nation, was ravaged by riots.
We were on our way to church that Sunday morning. It was Palm Sunday, I'll never forget, and I was pregnant with my youngest. And it was just terrible seeing these places torn up and seeing people running with shoes and clothing and food that they weren't going to use. And I think that was just the end of businesses.
Local people did not start the riot. You know how a riot is. Once it starts, everybody gets into it, but local people didn't start the riot. But in anger, In anger, you do a lot of things that you don't do when you're rational. See, they were bitter about unemployment and about the way they were being mistreated here.
The riots devastated the Hill. By the time the fires burned out, Wylie Avenue days were only a memory.
Well, those of you that have never seen it really missed something, because the Hill at that time was a very, very, very fine place to be.
Rackets, religion, lawyers, doctors, and the best economic progress we ever had occurred right there on Wylie Avenue. It brings back pleasant memories.
People were poor, but I don't think that they knew they were poor because they were enriched in so many other ways. People were willing to share what little bit they might have had.
I miss the realness, or the genuineness of the Hill District and the people who were there. They were real. They were people who cared about you. They were people who were concerned about you. It was like a family.
The Hill was just a real sweet and nostalgic part of my life. I would wish that everybody could have had a Hill to have grown up in.
Oh, when you smiling, when you smiling, the whole world smiles with you, baby. Oh, when you laughing, babe, when you laughing, the sun comes shining through. But when you crying, you bring on the rain, so stop your sighing. Be happy again and keep on smiling.